So welcome, Christophe.
Thank you, Adrian, for inviting me.
My pleasure. We wrote a blog post recently on applying the new science of sales and marketing messaging, and lots of people had questions, so we decided to run this webinar. Today we've got 15 minutes with you, Christophe, presenting your findings, and then we'll have a 15 minutes Q&A. So let's get started.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, the word persuasion means a lot to many people, but you may not realize it. It's front and center sometimes of your daily life. You are probably all looking to some extent to bring more business and close more customers. You may want to convert customers into ambassadors, into referral sources. You may want to convince vendors to become partners. And how about joining and inviting new employees? So any one of those situations can be either thrilling or extremely frustrating. You see, the subject of persuasion has been my passion, you could say my obsession, for nearly 30 years. I discovered along the way that it's rather complicated to decode persuasion. Why? Well, first of all, there's lots of research on the subject of persuasion. Humans have attempted to persuade each other for thousands of years. There's lots of theories and even books, including my new one. But more importantly, we're finally coming to the realization that as humans, as much as we want to believe that we are rational, logical, decision-making machine, we effectively are influenced by specific cognitive biases. And there's been an emerging, very interesting school based on cognitive psychology to recognize the importance of these predispositions, these preconceived ideas or beliefs. Many of them are not conscious, which influence our decisions. And of course, any event that would involve persuasion can be scary. In fact, the fear of public speaking is largely based on the notion that we may fail to convince and influence. But there are better days ahead. With the science that I will reveal to all of you, I truly believe that the subject of persuasion doesn't need to be as complicated, as esoteric as it has been for such a long time. And there are techniques and scientific principles that you can apply to be much better at it. First of all, let's recognize the obvious. We're receiving a ton of messages every single day. But sadly, you probably contribute to what I call spraying and praying. Yes, the volume of messages is such that our brain has no other option but to reject them all. And therefore, it is so important to, one, consider that messages have to be processed by an organ. And in case you're forgetting what I'm talking about, I brought my extra brain. But more importantly, it does need some sort of code in order for the message to grab attention, to deliver understanding without much cognitive effort, to stick, and more importantly, to influence or convince. We made our entire book, our entire theory of persuasion fit in that one visual. Obviously, you won't have enough time to look at it in this webinar. However, you can download it for free on our website. So feel free to understand that my purpose here is to guide you as quickly as I can through different steps that help you both understand and, more importantly, apply persuasion principles that will help you convince more successfully. There are 4 blocks of this teaching guide. First, we're going to talk very briefly about the theory of persuasion. Then we'll talk about the science and what we have learned about the brain and how the brain understands and processes persuasive messages. Then we'll talk about a simple process that you can follow that will be further explained in the workshop that I will do in London in a few months. And then we'll finish by the chemistry of persuasion. Now, the subject of a theory is always intimidating. I'm a professor of media psychology, and I have to apologize to my students that the field of persuasion theories is just so confusing and so boring. The truth is, we managed to identify 4 factors that will influence people. And those factors are, number one, your message will be received, processed, only to the extent that it is targeting core frustration or pain. Why would we have such preference for pain? Because it's a matter of survival. Therefore, the concept of frustration and pain is central to our theory. Number two, you need to have value, benefits, arguments that will produce medicine for that pain. That will be the essence of your value proposition, and we call that your claims. We advocate not using more than three. I'll come back to that. The third aspect of a persuasive message is, of course, that you have the ability to provide the evidence, the proof that your claims are believable, are real. So pain, claim, gain, as you can see, conveniently rhymes, is the essence of what you say in a message to make it persuasive. But it still has to be delivered and understood and accepted by a very unique part of the brain you will discover today called the primal brain. So let's talk about the brain. And the research that we've conducted there really started 20 years ago when I realized, having a real passion for research, that I couldn't trust what people tell me. That I was obviously, every single time I would do research or focus groups, putting too much truth or emphasis on the fact that the words convey exactly what people think. I realized that I had to go beyond words into people's brain. So I've been working on conducting research, which is now referred to as neuromarketing research or consumer neuroscience. And it involves the use of very specific techniques. Most of them were developed clinically in order to collect information that doesn't require people to share or verbalize what they think. I'll go very briefly for those of you who do not really like research as much as I do. I'll be brief. First of all, we do have technology to detect facial expressions, so we can sit people comfortably in front of computers, and through cameras and software, we can in fact detect the extent to which they're happy, sad, or upset. We do the same type of research on voice. Voice does contain some valuable information, such as nervousness or excitement, and we can reveal that beyond words. We do a lot of research involving eye tracking, the capacity to record where the eyes are going and for how long. We can also measure pupil dilation. We measure the skin moisture, which is a way of measuring the response of the autonomic nervous system. And finally, we also measure brain waves so that we can especially measure how well people are attentive and whether or not they're experiencing any kind of cognitive effort. So what have we discovered? Well, to simplify, because this organ is rather complicated, I would like you to understand that we have two functional brains. One that you're most familiar with is called the rational brain. It's the newly evolved brain, the brain that gave us the capacity to master more complicated thinking, cognitive functions such as reading, and of course, the predictive aspect of our brain, especially in the frontal lobe. But underneath this brain is a more evolutionary, older region called the primal brain. And as the name would suggest, this brain is rather ancient and focused primarily on our survival. And the reason this dual theory of brain activity is so central to what we do is because so many theories on persuasion have assumed that all you need to do is target the new brain to be persuasive. For instance, with text, and I'm not even going to go beyond a few words here with this life insurance message, you assume that text will be enough to convince the brain, except that you see in the primal brain, which is the first part of the brain to respond given the urgency of survival, text doesn't mean anything. And therefore, a message that is targeting the brain is first going to be received by the primal. And if the primal cannot decode it, it will abort. Meanwhile, this is also a life insurance message, rather provocative, but it goes straight to the primal brain by reminding people of the possibility that they can die. This message goes immediately to the primal brain, is then elaborated, meaning processed at a more intellectual level, if you will, in the thinking part of the brain, and particularly in the frontal lobe. So we've discovered that there are 6 ways to communicate to the primal brain. And I'll go very to influence the part of the brain that controls the persuasion process. We'll talk about how important it is to highlight threats and especially reawake the urgency around the importance of your message, to contrast so that you can only give two options for the brain, and that primal brain doesn't really want to deliberate, go, no go, or good or bad. The importance of providing evidence without much cognitive effort, we call that tangible. The importance of making your message memorable, the importance of making it primarily visual, as you will see, it's the dominant sense. And in conclusion, in this particular approach, the importance of triggering an emotional cocktail. Let's talk about making it personal. Again, we are selfish in the primal brain. Nothing is more urgent than protecting us and ensuring that we are safe and going to survive. And therefore, messages need to be intimately selfish and personal in order to grab attention. It's really important for you all to verify the extent to which your messages, when you create a persuasive messages, are fundamentally talking about the customers or the people that you're targeting instead of yourself. Too many websites and too many ads tend to put the company's history in the center of the story, which is of zero interest to the primal brain. Contrast is a way of accelerating decisions. We have a salient network in our brain, a network that is specifically designed to identify what is different so that we can accelerate our decisions. Therefore, you need to make your message salient, recognizable, very easy claims that contrast your world without us, and it should be painful, your world with us. The customers are not going to want to deliberate as much in their primal brain. They want to be told why I should be using you. This is an interesting way of making a claim in order to verify that this brand of duct tape is excellent. You want to understand how much it's going to hold. Tangible is really making sure that what you talk about, what you present, is provable. You see, our brain is receiving tons of data, but we can't process more than 50 bits per second. Therefore, the whole idea of making a message tangible is to simplify it. Making it memorable is to recognize that as we process any kind of message, there is a U-shaped curve, the beginning and the end, and we tend to forget everything in the middle. Therefore, in the way we approach the narrative of a persuasive message, we want to insist on optimizing the beginning and the end points. More importantly, and we've talked already about that, don't be afraid to highlight a pain, a worry, a frustration right at the beginning of your narrative, because it will hijack the primal brain. And doing so will effectively engage as you're developing your message and your value proposition by presenting your claims, and we recommend to not go beyond 3, and you supply with every single one of your claim the relevant evidence. You conclude in your message, whether it's a 30-second message or a 2-message or 10-minute presentation, you have to conclude by repeating everything you just said. In conclusion, there's a really imminent fire. We have the best extinguishers, and I'm going to create a demo right in front of your eyes so that you can believe so. We are, of course, sensory machines, but no other sense is more dominant than the visual sense. And this is very important. You have the superhighway to the primal brain by making a message entirely visual. Look at your ads, look at your websites, and you will find that most of the time, the meaning of what you want to say cannot be decoded visually only. Text is great. I have nothing against text, but it doesn't go to the primal brain. You need to have layers in your message experiences that is purely visual. And this is a great reminder of how unsafe it is to not click your seatbelt in the back of a seat. And finally, emotions are critical chemicals that help us decide. Therefore, you cannot be persuasive unless you create an emotional cocktail. Lots of models on emotions. I'm going to remind you of a couple that I think are very helpful in terms of making sure your message is indeed releasing hormones and neurotransmitters throughout our body. The model who discovered effectively what emotions do to our faces are very interesting. He identifies 7 emotions specifically that can create the same faces on anybody's face around the planet. But this particular one is also rather simple. I want you to think in terms of how your narrative, your story, can begin by especially a negative emotion and finish by a positive emotion. We call that an emotional lift. So never forget that emotions do produce more than states, but also movements, i.e. the term movement in terms of emotions. They do trigger decisions, and more importantly, they also improve retention. Therefore, an emotional cocktail is not an option. It's absolutely necessary to be persuasive. As this ad on non-smoking advocacy reminds you. So we've just found out that there are 2 brains. We discovered that to create a narrative that will be persuasive, you need 6 elements. So I'll finish by mentioning the 3 steps that are effectively so critical to build an important message. First and foremost, always remember that pain is centered in the construction of your message. Sure, it's great to know that people like and want and need, but nothing is more important than digging into the pain. It's rather a deeper dive into the unconscious, but it's what's going to drive your message. As Domino Pizza a long time ago figured out, what is really important to sell more pizza is to focus on the fact that people don't want to wait and not know when it will show up. So look at your pains, identify their urgency, and create messages that will target them. The second process is to find your claims. You don't have the luxury of a laundry list of benefits, and therefore you need to pick one. When I was shopping for a digital projector 10 years ago, I found the smallest projector, but it wasn't the best one to use. Therefore, I shifted to another projector because it was the easiest to use. Identify what is the why in your message so that people can focus on the compelling reasons why they should choose your product or benefit instead of a laundry list of reasons. In most of the clients that we help, we identify only a compelling set of 3 reasons, such as this law firm. And I'll close by, again, inviting you to identify your claims, making sure they point to the pain, and that you can verify that they are unique compared to your competition, and wordsmith them so that they're memorable. So we'll finish by discussing only the 3rd steps here, which is to make sure you're providing the evidence and make sure that your proofs are such that they can really convince, such as customer stories, physically demonstrating what you can do, data, and vision. And this will close the brief introduction to the science of persuasion, and I'll let Adrian field some questions, as I think we still have about 10 minutes to do so.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That was a great overview. So we've had quite a few questions come through. One that keeps occurring is, why don't more people know about this?
Well, the truth is the field of neuromarketing is a very young field, and so is the field of neuroscience. I like to say the neuroscience is no longer for neuroscientists, but it's been a while since I've looked at textbooks on marketing, but I can assure you that most of my students tell me that they have never heard of the possibility of bringing neuroscience into marketing. So yes, it's rather new, except that for 2 decades, I've been in the trenches, so to speak, and traveled a lot around the world to spread the gospel. And I do think that it will continue to reawaken enthusiasm about the possibility that marketing and messaging can be a more scientific field.
So is it that the historical way of doing marketing has been based on people making guesses, maybe, you know, even looking at email stats, or as you said, speaking to customers? But then, as you said, people don't know what they don't know, and they don't tend to deliberately lie, but they might be doing it unconsciously. So is this what neuroscience is bringing up?
Yes, for too long, we've basically trusted that people will tell us the truth, but I don't necessarily suggest that all customers are liars. What I suggest is our consciousness, our ability to observe, our responses is limited. And therefore, we have no other option but to dig into the subconscious mechanisms that are happening inside the brain at lightning speed. And those processes we've discovered are much more important than we once believed. We believed that consciousness ruled everything. Now we know that the way we orient our visual attention is within milliseconds. And there's no way at that speed we can be highly conscious of it.
Yeah, I read somewhere recently that the average person is only truly conscious for 10% of the time. You cannot always be in the moment. Your mind does wander, go places, etc.
Nor will we want, Adrian. It would be absolutely awful for us to have consciousness of every single critical neurophysiological decision that our body needs to make.
Yeah,
I like to
just
say,
remembering to breathe all the time.
exactly. I like to say that consciousness is overrated. And so much of our opinions and views are based on the fact that we're conscious. And that's why we ignore, and sadly, many of our problems, contemporary problems, are because we do not have the ability to awaken to the urgency and importance of matters that affect our survival.
So I've got a couple of more questions here. One is around an email marketer who is saying that she doesn't know the pains of the people she's sending something to. So she can't create the claim in the game, etc. And she's tried to guess, trying to look at concrete examples by talking about customer success, but she's still not getting responses. What do you think could be, do you have a concrete example there of what the issue could be?
Well, in our book, we talk about doing a diagnose of the pain, and if you have even a sample of a few customers, it can be extremely powerful to invite them to talk about what frustrates them, what worries them, and sampling is everything in terms of the quality of your data, but rather than just make it intuitive and purely out of your creative mind, you might as well just engage into what we call pain dialogues, and then from that raw material begin to create narratives that will highlight the pain and figure out which one is going to work best. I mean, most of my clients are really committed to the idea of diagnosing and identifying first and foremost the pains that keep people awake at night.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we have another question here asking about, do you have any proof of the positive effect of neuromarketing in business cases?
There's lots of evidence now after 20 years. In our own book, we have 30 business cases of persuasive campaigns that are following those principles. It is a field that has now extensively published. It takes a while to publish a paper, an average of 2 to 3 years. So it's been rather slow to trickle in, but it's no longer a new field by any measure. And I invite people to realize and to some extent awaken to the urgency of tapping into this very rich, very powerful science.
Yeah, makes sense. So also have a question here about, in the B2B world, there's still a lot of talk about features. In this person's experience, the leadership of companies come up through the ranks from a technical background, either a product or a technical point of view, because they were the creators of the solution. They're not buying into neuroscience-oriented thinking. How do you change that in the leadership of the business to move the business away from this into a pain-centric approach versus just keeping up with competitive tit-for-tat on features and functions?
Well, the fallacy of the business-to-business approach is to assume, because it's a more complicated, evolved value proposition, that you need to be more sophisticated and more details. I like to say there is no such thing as business-to-business or even business-to-consumer. It's business to brains. And so if you realize that whatever you sell, whether it's a bar of chocolate or a multi-million-dollar value proposition, you still have to create a message that needs to ignite interest in the brain. Features and functions at the beginning of the persuasive process will not ignite the primal brain. What ignites the primal brain is reminding me that there are dangers or risks that I have not completely identified, and fortunately you have, and that you have uniquely assembled a value proposition around 3 compelling reasons why you should choose them. That narrative is going to create the interest and move the conversation towards features and functions. But that's the real fundamental of our model. Persuasion is a bottom-up effect. It goes from primal to rational, not the other way around.
So then all initial decisions that come to our mind start in the primal mind, then we start to think about it consciously. So if I'm going to buy a newspaper, I make that decision in 2 or 3 seconds as I'm walking past a shop. And in B2B, you might make that decision over 3, 6, 12 months, but there's still the initial starting point of capturing your attention. And then maybe months later, when you're getting closer to buying something, that's when you get down to the features and functions and the details of, well, should we choose this company or this company? But I still feel by the time you get to that stage, you've kind of made a decision on your gut, on the company that you trust and you want to work for. And I've seen this, that people do RFPs and they reverse engineer it to the person they want to win or the person they trust and want to work with. And I'm guessing that's not to do with the primal brain. Could you add anything to that?
Yeah, Adrian, I would actually probably provocatively suggest that that process you just described of moving from primal to rational doesn't happen over a long period of time necessarily. It could happen in a 10-minute conversation. It could be, in fact, for the most part, completely unconscious. In other words, most people truly believe they will buy using their rational mind, when in fact, they have received the poking and the influence of the primal brain. And so this is part of the challenge here. So much of our experience is conscious, that we believe that we control and use a linear process using facts and logic to make decisions, but we don't realize, because we don't see it, we don't measure the tremendous influence and control the primal brain exerts on the decisions.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and it's, how do you think the explosion of social media is influencing neuroscience-oriented marketing?
Well, it's make it more urgent and crucial to create messages that can cut through the noise. I mean, the white noise created by social media has made it much more difficult for marketers to create messages that are noticed, that are grabbing any sort of attention. We receive nearly 20 to 25,000 ads per day that are attempting to alert our brain. I don't know what the number is on social media specifically, but it's a shower of messages that we ignore. Because we don't have the choice. Our brain energy is too precious, it's too valuable. If we attended to all those messages, we would go crazy.
On the 28th and 29th of April, Christophe and I will be in London for 2 days doing a workshop. First day, we'll go into a very deep dive on, for you to understand how neuroscience works and how to apply it to your business and your messaging. And the second day is very much a hands-on workshop of, let's take your current company messages and how do you apply what you've learned on day 1. So is there anything you'd like to add to that, Chris?
No, we welcome obviously people to not just learn more about the science, which is such a fascinating subject, but to realize that they are very simple and very powerful techniques, tools, processes that you, during the workshop, can learn to revamp an entire campaign, to redo your website, to improve your own presentation skills, which are front and center of many of you who are, let's say, in business to business. So please come in and join the fun and the science of persuasion with me.
I can guarantee you it will be a fun day because I've been through it myself many times. Okay, well, let's leave it there, Christophe. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I know we're going to have more questions, so just drop me an email afterwards. Let's have a call, whatever suits you. Let's keep the conversation going.